Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. On July 4th, 1776, our founding fathers cut America's ties with England by adopting the Declaration of Independence. The author of their manifesto was only 33 years old. Thomas Jefferson, philosopher, diplomat, president, slaveholder, and sometime radical. Who was Thomas Jefferson, and what would he think of our nation today? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Judge Robert Bork of the American Enterprise Institute and author of The Tempting of America, Professor Peter Onuf, the holder of the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Chair at the University of Virginia and editor of Jeffersonian Legacies, James Oliver Horton, a scholar of the Jeffersonian era, professor of history and American studies at George Washington University, and author of Free People of Color Inside the African American Community, and Jan Lewis of Rutgers University and author of The Pursuit of Happiness, Family and Values in Jeffersons, Virginia. The question before this House, what about Jefferson? This week on Think Tank. In 1962, at a dinner honoring Nobel Prize winners, President John F. Kennedy said, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent and of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." Some historians say that Thomas Jefferson was the last Renaissance man. The author of the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States spoke 6 languages and was an accomplished inventor, naturalist, mathematician, and architect. Jefferson personally designed his home, Monticello, as well as the University of Virginia. Jefferson's greatest legacy, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. It is probably the single most recognized and copied political document in the world. Its powerful words still resonate everywhere. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, how could the man who wrote those stirring words own 150 slaves? And unlike George Washington, who freed all of his slaves upon his death, Jefferson freed only 5. But he thought slavery would not last, declaring, "Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free." Political life was not easy for Jefferson. His hatred of aristocracy made him a strong supporter of the French Revolution. His enemies charged that he was too fond of popular uprisings, calling him Mad Tom and the Robespierre of the American mob. But supporters hailed him as the mammoth of democracy and as the man of the people. He died on July 4th, 1826. On his tomb, he asked to be remembered as the author of the Declaration of Independence, the founder of the University of Virginia, and author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Professor Onuf, Peter Onuf, let's start out. What kind of a man was he?
Jefferson was an extraordinary man, as your list of his achievements indicates. We still don't know what to make of him, though. I think the notion of Renaissance man is a kind of fudge. He's everything, which means that we don't really know what he is. What's most remarkable about Jefferson, the Democrat, is that if anybody represents the aristocratic impulses in America before the Revolution, it's Jefferson and his class in Virginia. In effect, he's the cream of the Virginia aristocracy. And it's remarkable that he could embrace these ideas that we now take to be the defining ideas of democracy.
Jim Horton?
Jefferson is an extraordinary man, was an extraordinary man. He was also a very complicated man. And in that regard, I think he becomes the personification, really, of American society. He is a person of great principle, but a person who cannot always achieve that which his principles would dictate. I think the same can be said of our society. Great principles, we don't always live up to them.
Jan Lewis?
I'd like to go back to a point that Peter made and talk about this conundrum or paradox that Jefferson is the exponent of democracy, yet in many ways he comes from an aristocratic background. Historians, I don't think, have ever been able to explain fully that paradox, how a man of such privilege, and who in many ways maintains privilege in that beautiful setting at Monticello, how he's able to go beyond his background and come up with ideas that are supposed to apply to all people and that all people have chosen as their banner.
Bob Bork, Judge Bork, Lawyer Bork, you are surrounded by historians here. What do you make of Jefferson as a lawgiver, law writer? I mean, that's what he is principally known as, I guess.
Well, if you mean the Declaration of Independence, of course, that is really in part a propaganda document. It's a rhetorical document. It's not really part of our law. I suppose the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom was a great achievement, but I don't think of Jefferson primarily as a lawgiver.
Why not? I mean, he...
Well, for one thing, you know, if Jefferson's principles had prevailed, they would have destroyed the United States. The Union would have been gone. He thought, for example, that the states could nullify acts of Congress if they thought each state thought it was unconstitutional. He didn't believe in judicial review. He thought each branch of government could decide constitutionality for itself. He,
in other words, that was the great fight with Chief Justice Marshall.
Yes, that was part of his fight with Marshall. He wanted a new constitutional convention every 20 years. James Madison talked him out of that one. But obviously, if these principles had prevailed, we would have had the states would have fragmented and the Union would have been destroyed.
I think it's only fair to say, Bob, that if Hamilton's principles had prevailed, the same thing would have happened.
Well, that could well be.
Was Jefferson a radical? Is that fair to say? I mean, all this stuff about watering the tree of liberty with human blood every 20 years, that sort of stuff?
I think some of his rhetoric was radical. And just to get back to the point you were making here, his notions about being able to review, each state being able to review and to decide congressional rulings for themselves, I mean, that comes in the context of the fear that he had that the Federalists at the time, the Alien Sedition Acts, were really concentrating power in the hands of the federal government to a dangerous extent. So in some ways that was a reaction. I'm not sure that if the context had been different, he would have held to that belief.
Well, certainly when he interpreted the Constitution, he interpreted federal power very narrowly. And this would have been a very different nation if he'd prevailed.
Let me ask you a question. If Thomas Jefferson were alive today, would he be a Democrat or a Republican, Jan?
My son, I have to introduce this by saying, my son, who is 16 and has attended many of the festivities around Jefferson's 250th birthday last year, got so frustrated with this question that he insisted if Thomas Jefferson were alive today, he'd be 250 years old. And I think historians resist that sort of question because the times were so extraordinarily different. That much said, I will say that we can follow different parts of the Jeffersonian legacy, and they go in very different directions. As Bob has suggested, there's a states' rights Jefferson that leads to nullification and to the southern side of the Civil War, and you can see those ideas developing. At the same time, there's Jefferson, the rights giver, and who leads to the sort of rights consciousness that we associate with liberal Democrats. So there are different parts of his legacy that lead in very different directions.
How could a man who, I mean, at times when you read about him, he sounds like sort of an agrarian nut. I mean, he hates cities, he hates mobs, he hates people in cities. How could a man like that be a member of the Democratic Party today?
Well, he distrusts cities.
I think that's misleading in any case, that notion of his hating cities. He's a very urbane man. He loves urbanity and civility, that is, the good things that cities bring. His political project is in opposition to the metropolis, the concentration of power that he resisted in the patriotic resistance movement before the Revolution, and the danger that such concentrations would emerge in America under the aegis of the Hamiltonian system.
Sure. And to show you how complex and how contradictory he was, you're absolutely right that he feared the concentration of federal power, but he used federal power when he was in the federal office when he was President of the United States. For example, the Louisiana Purchase, which expanded the size of the United States several times.
And which was unconstitutional.
Which was, at least he was not sure that it was constitutional, and said that he was not sure it was unconstitutional.
Judge Bork, was it unconstitutional, the purchase?
Probably it was, but there was a great disconnect between Jefferson's words and his actions as president. In fact, when he was president, he had to evade all of the principles that he laid down before he became president. Not only the Louisiana Purchase, but he sent off the Navy and the Marine Corps to Tripoli to attack the Barbary pirates.
Without getting congressional approval.
That's right. It's one of the earliest precedents for a president initiating hostilities without a declaration of war.
What about his his attitude toward race and slavery? How do we deal with that now?
Jefferson, well, he was obviously a slaveholder, obviously a man who was uncomfortable with the institution of slavery, who thought the institution of slavery was wrong, and even so, could not bring himself to free his own slaves. He only freed 8 slaves his entire, well, 3 during his lifetime, 5 in his will. A man with some 200 slaves who never moved to the position of liberalism on the question of slavery that many in his own time, in his own region did. So that although he was in some ways a leader in terms of democratic thinking, he lagged behind more progressive thinking on the question of slavery, even for his time period.
Well, I think early on he proposed a measure that no slavery would be allowed in new states, and he lost that by 1 vote in the Congress.
Sure, but when the new states were actually opening up, 1820, he went exactly in the opposite direction. He denounced all that, said that slavery ought to be allowed wherever it would expand.
I think we have to understand the limits of the notion of equality. And to some extent, we have to accept that when Jefferson articulates universal principles, he comes up against difference, which he can't accommodate in his scheme. That is, it's one of the aspects of liberalism to generalize and universalize rights that we define ever more clearly the boundary between those who are capable of bearing rights and those who are not. This is where Jefferson's racism comes to the fore, what we would call his racism. He naturalized difference. He couldn't accept artificial difference, that is aristocracy, where privileged families would rule over others. But there were differences, for instance, in the family between men and women, parents and children, between races. He believed that African Americans were naturally inferior.
Yeah, I think when we read his statements in the Notes on the State of Virginia about blacks, they make us extremely uncomfortable today. And that this is the paradox with Jefferson. I mean, he absolutely knows that slavery is wrong. Everyone at the time knows that Jefferson is opposed to slavery, particularly at the time of the Revolution. There's no question where the Declaration of Independence leads, that will lead to the elimination of slavery. At the same time, Jefferson plays around with and creates a racism today that makes us, I think, very uncomfortable when we read those words.
Did Thomas Jefferson have an affair with Sally Hemings, a slave on his plantation?
Obviously, we don't know the answer to that question. There is lots of circumstantial evidence that he did, but there is no smoking gun. I don't know of anybody who could testify, yes, I know for sure that he did. But as I said,
one argument I would make against the relationship, and I don't like to put myself in the position of defending Jefferson on this, is I think the main reason why it's not likely to have happened is that he was such a racist. And for him, miscegenation, mixing the races, blurring the line between black and white, created this unbearable dissonance and tension. Many of the people in the Hemings connection were light-skinned. They could have passed for white. And to perpetuate that confusion of the races, while you're claiming that the races are so distinct in their capabilities, is to make an unbearable situation.
Yes, but it would have been very much in keeping with the kind of ethical dilemmas and inconsistency that we know Jefferson had routinely in his life.
Jan, you have written about family life
Yes.
of Jefferson and his time. Where do you come out on the great Sally Hemings mystery?
Oh, I blame the nephews.
You blame the nephews.
The family,
Wasn't
in
there
fact.
one child that was born exactly 9 months after he returns as ambassador to France?
Well, the timing is such, the people have done this research, the timing is such that Jefferson might have been the father, that he was in the vicinity 9 months before the birth of each of Sally Hemings' children.
But so were the nephews, you're saying?
No one's done the research on the nephews. The family thought that it was the nephews, and in fact, many years afterwards, when they would say, "Well, we know it was Uncle Peter, it was Uncle Sam," and what I find significant about that is that even if Thomas Jefferson himself were not the father of Sally Hemings' children, which I think I would agree with Peter, not likely, could be, but not likely, even if he weren't, by the family's own admission, these children would have been Jefferson's great nephews and nieces. They were family. And I think that this is a metaphor for race relations in this country, in that we're all in some way family, and we should all acknowledge that we are all related, that all of us are the descendants of Thomas Jefferson, if not literally, metaphorically.
Let me ask a question here. Here you have, as we're talking here, you have a man who certainly, on the race issue, does not seem like the great exemplar and trumpeter of human liberty. And yet, around the world, forget about America for a minute, Jefferson, not Washington, not Hamilton, is every revolutionary in the world, the good guys as well as the totalitarians, wave the Declaration of Independence and say, all men are created equal, self-determination. Sure. Where is that hypocrisy? I mean,
well, Forrest McDonald, who was an historian, said that Jefferson combined deviousness, slipperiness, hypocrisy with charm and grace and a sure sense of his own purposes, which are priceless assets in a politician. So that he did say a lot of
Does
things.
it remind you of anybody?
Well, you know, here you have the difference between his actions and his words. There is great reverence within 19th century black society for his words. The conventions of blacks that were held throughout the 1830s and the 1840s started off every meeting with the reading of the Declaration of Independence. So that in terms of his words, they were revered within the black community, because after all, those black people did believe all men were created equal and so on. Actions,
he was a great rhetorician,
criticized.
and he got off a lot of phrases that today we would identify with the New Left, and which is why I think a lot of his rhetoric is so popular in an egalitarian age. But he was not an egalitarian. He referred to the people, when he opposed the idea of direct election of senators, he referred to the people as the swinish multitude.
The swinish multitude. That's a pretty good bumper sticker for a politician.
Well, I think the problem is not formulated properly when we talk about the disjunction between words and actions. I think we're looking at the outside in. We're saying, what are the boundaries? How far do you go, Jefferson? Aha, we found you. We've caught you out. These are the limits. You can't be serious. This is just nonsense. But if we start with Jefferson's own experience of his world and talk about what his aspirations were, then it looks differently. Take the whole idea of equality. Equality is the buzzword of the Revolutionary period. Now, we have appropriated it for our own multifarious purposes now, but for Jefferson and his fellow patriot leaders, equality refers specifically to their status and the status of their colonies in the British Empire. It was grounded in a notion of English rights. It was very specific. And what Jefferson did was try to reach beyond that, not as far as we would like him to, perhaps, but the idea that you could form even a union of liberty-loving, free Americans was itself an act of faith, an intellectual leap. So if we look at it from Jefferson's perspective, inside out, then I think we have rather a different view than if we take this perspective of why isn't he good enough for us today? Why doesn't he do what we do, we politically correct moderns?
But let's not judge him by the standards of our time. Let's judge him by the standards of his own time. There are people in his own time who risked their careers, who risked their fortunes in ways that are far more egalitarian than Jefferson was willing to do.
Let's move on for a moment to the legacy of Jefferson. There was this big argument between Jefferson and Hamilton about what kind of America are we going to have. Jefferson sort of taking this rural agrarian view, and Hamilton writing the, what is it called about manufacturers, a report on manufacturers, looking toward a booming, muscular sort of industrial society. Is it fair then to say, given what America is today, that the true father of this America is Hamilton, not Jefferson?
It seems to me that really that they both are. I mean, what we get out of the Hamiltonian legacy is a strong, active, huge federal government, a centralized government. But we still have also the Jefferson suspicion of a strong government. And it's in the space between those two, the actuality of a centralized state and an American suspicion of a centralized state. That's where American history is made.
See, I think it's wrong to think of either of them as the father of the country. This country would have developed as it did if Jefferson and Hamilton had never existed. Jefferson's idea of an agrarian society was doomed from the beginning. You couldn't succeed and live in this world as an agrarian society. We would be overrun by other powers. And the growth of the central government was a natural development. People wanted it. George Washington immediately began proposing projects that were well outside the federal power in the Constitution.
So your current argument that you make these days, you would have been making that in 1790, that these guys are using too much federal power, more than the Constitution gave them.
Well, the Constitution certainly doesn't give the federal government the power it now has, but the Constitution could not stop the federal power from growing. There's no way it can stop it. I think the strong central government was in the cards, whatever the Constitution said.
I think we misunderstand Jefferson's legacy if we think of him simply as an agrarian, this quaint figure who's attached to a romanticized past, who resists modernity and all the ills associated with it. I think Jefferson instead, his impact on American history has been to authorize and license private initiative, a release of energy. His preference for agriculture is a preference for commercial agriculture and the initiatives of individual farmers and then traders as well. He believed that to force developed manufacturers, as Hamilton was going to do, would in fact be retrograde, would not contribute to the wealth of the nation or its future prosperity. And you could argue that through much of the 19th century, until the great concentrations of capital that emerged in the Civil War and afterwards, that this was the prescription, this was the formula that was going to make America the way it was. So I think there was a choice early on, and it is significant that the Jeffersonians emerged in power with the so-called Revolution of 1800.
What about Jefferson and the world? I mean, what did that piece of paper mean, that Declaration of Independence? Forget America for a minute. It's complicated, and we've explored it.
Forget America.
A little bit. Yeah, forget America. That's an easy one to write up. Bob, is that the revolutionary document of the world?
Well, I think as the world becomes increasingly egalitarian, the Declaration becomes an inspiration to people. And that's true of, I think, throughout Western civilization.
And it's been used by good guys and bad guys.
Oh, sure.
But I think that probably the most important thing here is that it provides a touchstone. For those people who are oppressed, it is a document to which they can turn, to which they can appeal. It becomes a way of appealing to the conscience of the nation. And without that document, without us saying to the world, this is what we believe, it becomes very difficult for oppressed people within the country to appeal to a conscience, to say, if you say you believe that, you must act in that way. And it seems to me that that's the importance of the Declaration. Jefferson didn't always do it, but the fact that he put this Declaration there makes it possible for us to have a touchstone.
I think there's another dimension of Jeffersonian thought having to do with equality that relates to this, and that is the equality that Jefferson hoped to achieve, as I mentioned before, was the equality of the American colonies. And that notion of equality applied to states and to nations is, I think, probably the most significant Jeffersonian legacy. On the level of rhetoric, it's human equality that we refer to, but it's really national self-determination, nation-making, the independence of states that's been, I think, the great legacy of the American Revolution and of Jefferson's Declaration.
Okay, thank you, Professor Peter Onuf, Professor James Horton, Professor Jan Ellen Lewis, Judge Robert Bork, and thank you, We have appreciated hearing from you very much. Please send any comments or questions to the address on the screen. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.